Good evening. There we go. Welcome to Low Carb Houston. Yeah. I'm Bill Amonette. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Houston Clear Lake and a director for our Exercise and Nutritional Health Institute. I've interacted with many of you via email, and so it's great to shake hands and put faces to names. And I haven't met you yet. Please come up at some point and say hello, and let's get to know each other. This is our first of what will be an annual conference that we'll hold each year in October. So thank you for being here for this inaugural event. A couple of housekeeping notes as we get started. First thing is restrooms. So if you go upstairs and you take a right out the doors, there's a set of restrooms over there. If you go across the atrium, there's another set of restrooms. If you go this direction over here, just past the library, you'll also find another set of restrooms. So if you have any trouble finding anything, we have student volunteers, faculty volunteers that are positioned all around here that are happy to help you. There are two exits to the theater. We have an exit in the back, and then we have an exit down here. You cannot re-enter through the bottom exit, through the first floor exit, so you have to re-enter through the second floor exit. Vendor areas, I'm sure all of you have seen over here to the left outside of the theater. Please take some time and go by and check out some of the products that our vendors are here displaying. Dinner tomorrow night is sold out, so unless you bought a ticket for the Ali Miller, Monica Pope dinner, unfortunately we sold out of those. We will be providing lunch tomorrow for purchase. Chartwell is preparing a ketogenic meal. I believe tomorrow is salmon and asparagus, and then on Saturday they're preparing pork ribs or brisket and broccoli. There's a concert here Saturday night. If anybody stays around, Alex, our theater director, has offered a special discount for Low Carb Houston attendees if you'd like to stay here and go to a conference or go to a concert. Want to talk to you a little bit about how this conference came about. In April, I got a call from Dr. Ali. It was on a Saturday afternoon. He had just gotten through riding his bike. And he called me and he said, Bill, I want to do a low carb conference, and I want to do it at the University of Houston of Clear Lake. And I thought it was great, and I said, yeah, maybe next April it would be a great time to hold a conference. And he said, no, I want to do it in September. And we were able to back him down a little bit to October. After we worked a bit to try to get things going, it was really June 25th before we really started moving and started accepting registrations. To put that in perspective, most conferences like this will begin offering registration a year beforehand. There are a lot of people that worked really hard to make this happen, and I want to recognize a few of those. I want to thank our president, Ira Blake, who really has supported us through this all, and our provost, Dr. Berberich, Rhonda Thompson, Chris Thompson, Richard Zalasak, Karen Barbier, Suzanne Clark, Kimberly August, and all of the student volunteers that you see here today that have made this possible in such a fast time, and our entire web and communications team. I know Dr. Ali is going to thank him as well, but I want to say thank you also to Dr. Byrne, who's been a mentor to both Dr. Ali and I as we prepared a grant that would help to fund part of this conference. We're thankful to the Moore Family Foundation for their generous support of this work, and Dr. Ali and I are personally thankful to Dr. Byrne for his mentorship of us. And of course, our speakers. We have a dynamic group of speakers. When Dr. Ali had the vision for this conference and started talking to me about it and listing off the names that might come here, I thought there was no way that we could pull it off. But every name that he said is here this weekend. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you for sharing with this Houston community the benefits of a low-carb, high-fat diet. When Dr. Ali called me in April, the first thing he said is, Bill, I want us to do a conference, but here's the most important thing. I don't want us to make any money from it. And I thought, well, that's weird coming from a cardiologist, but that gives you a glimpse of who he is as a person, who he is as a physician. He's in this to help people. Many of you are here tonight because of what he has done for you in his practice. He holds every month seminars, low-carb, high-fat diets for free out of the Clear Lake Regional Hospital. Dr. Ali is a person who's changed many, many lives, and I am honored to introduce the man whose vision made this conference possible, my colleague and my friend, Dr. Nadir Ali.
I don't deserve any of that, but thank you. So my primary job is to spend as little time here as possible so that the speakers can be here. So I just have a 3-minute intro, and I will not be encroaching into Andreas' time. So the first person that I really wanted to thank is my mentor, who has helped me, guided me, shaped me, and that's Dr. John Byrne. He's sitting right here in the front row, and I'd ask him to stand, and please. Without him guiding us, without him doing what he does for us, we would not be able to do this. Now, Bill is the next person that I think is the most important person behind this conference, not me. If he had not put in tireless amounts of work, he's responded to every single email. He's given you information about the parking lot. No question about this conference has been anything but the most important thing for him. So I thank him for that, and we should give him a big round. I am completely under the radar. Nobody knows who I am. And no one would have come here. None of the speakers would have come here. And I don't know if Jeff is here in the audience or not. There he is. He just enters, just as soon as his picture shows up. And that is one kind man, because if he had not trusted me, and he didn't know me very much, and written to all of you saying that this crazy cardiologist wants to put a conference in Houston, please come. And without him inviting you guys, you would not have been here. Now, right beside him is Ivor. Do I see you there, Ivor? The light, oh, there he is. Ivor is our co-program director, and he is made the curricula for us, but more importantly, I think he galvanizes this field, and I think his greatest contribution is this. Would you agree, Ivor? To bring the work of Dr. Joseph Kraft into our awareness. So with that, 1 minute left, and in that, I'm going to take 30 seconds to introduce Andreas Eenfeldt. Nobody here does not know him. His dietdoctor.com website gets over 350,000 to 1 million hits per day. I don't think there is a speaker in here who has not used his slides and has not benefited from his work. And I don't want to take time away from him and tell you who he is, because he's going to come here and do it himself. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadir. Great. So I'm really excited to be here to share some practical things about low-carb diets or keto diets or ketogenic diets. I'm sure you've all heard a lot about it, but I want to perhaps share some new insights about how it can be really useful for certain things like weight loss, like reversal of type 2 diabetes and more. So I'll start with a disclosure. So me and our team, we run the health website Diet Doctor. As Nadir said, it's the largest low-carb site in the world, and the goal is to empower people by making low-carb simple. This is funded by an optional membership section. We have no ads, we take no money from industry, and we sell no products. So it's funded by the people. And also another disclosure, I eat low carb. I've done that for quite some time now, so that's my dietary bias. I'm inclined to believe that hopefully it's not going to kill me, at least not too soon. Fairly confident about that. So this chart is online searches for keto diet in the last few years. It's probably the most popular sort of dietary treatment for health or weight loss online at the moment. So I'm sure you've all seen news about it. And the idea is, I mean, it's a strict low carb diet, meaning you're supposed to avoid carbohydrates to get that sort of effect that you could get from a keto diet. Meaning you will eat things like this, perhaps, like natural fats, meat, fish, vegetables, eggs, and so on, while avoiding large amounts of carbohydrates, like these kind of foods, bread, beer, potatoes, pasta, and so on. And I think the common sort of perception in some people, probably not so many people here, but outside of here, is that, well, then you're eating loads of bacon, and then you're having coffee with butter in it in the morning. And you know, some people do that. I'm not sure I would recommend basing your diet on this, but it's possible. It's certainly low carb, but it doesn't have to be like that. So this is also a ketogenic low carb diet, potentially a Caesar salad. Let's get rid of the croutons. This is a keto diet, potentially. It's not pasta though. You'll have to replace it with something else. I think in this case it's cream cheese and eggs, and or you could maybe slice up some aubergine, put it in there, really good. This is keto. This is keto also. Plenty of eggs in there, I can promise you that. Here's a classic breakfast, bacon and eggs, if you do want bacon. So in a way, it's almost completely the opposite of conventional dietary advice, because you're supposed to not eat meat. You're supposed to eat your whole grains, eat your fruit 5 times a day, and so on. And this is like, no, not like that. It's very different. So maybe that's a good thing, though, because looking back, you could tell this story in many ways, but we start in 1984. 1984 is the year that George Orwell wrote about in his novel about Big Brother. In the same year, the American government started with, you know, a renewed sense of certainty, telling people how to think about food. So you're supposed to fear eggs, you're supposed to fear meat or fat or cholesterol, because cholesterol is supposed to, you know, give you a heart attack, right? And that's what I believed back then, and that's what a lot of people believed. But there really wasn't any good scientific evidence to prove that this was a good idea. It's just a belief. And the thing that people might have kind of predicted, perhaps, if they had been very smart, is that there could be a hidden danger in this. Because when you tell people to fear all these kinds of natural foods, people will likely get hungrier, and they will have to eat something else, which is carbohydrates, because most of the energy in our foods comes from fat or carbohydrates. So more carbohydrates, and I think a lot of people thought, okay, they will eat kale and broccoli, it's going to be great. But you know that's not the kind of carbohydrates you easily find wherever you go. So instead you might find low-fat products full of sugar, full of processed carbohydrates. That's what's easy to get. So this is obesity statistics from the US. I think a lot of people have seen this. I have actually updated these slides with the absolutely newest data from last year. So this is back in 1985, after this campaign was launched, after people started getting afraid of fat, eating more sugar and carbs instead. obesity levels were close to 10%. Let's move ahead a few years to 91, and you see a new color, dark blue, which is over 15% obesity. That's quite a jump from 10 to 15% in a few years. 97, a new color, yellow, over 20% obesity. 03, orange color, over 25% obesity. 2009, the brown color, over 30%. 2015, yes, another color, the dark color here, over 35% obesity. So, has it stopped? Or is it still going on? Here's 2017, worse than ever. Just keeps getting worse. So, in just one generation, 3 times more obesity. It's pretty crazy. So, a lot of people in America have this issue now. A lot of kids have this issue. And if you look at the obesity chart of the world, sort of all the different countries, you see the United States at the top. So America has been made great, at least in size. The heavyweight champion of the world, showing the way for the rest of us. Sweden is where I'm from, is down close to the bottom with only 12% obesity, which means that 88% of Swedes still look like this. Not entirely sure if it's a good thing, but so 3 times more obesity in one generation. Of course, it's not just about obesity, because there is other health issues that sort of come with this epidemic, and one of them is diabetes type 2. So let's look at diabetes, what happened to that. It started in the 60s at around 2% of the adult population, and then we got the dietary guidelines for Americans. And then something happened. Of course, it's correlation is not causation. We don't know what caused what here. Maybe nothing caused anything, but it doesn't really look like it helped much, these sort of low-fat, high-carb dietary guidelines. And of course, diabetes is a disease where you have too much sugar in the blood, and the sugar in the blood comes from the carbohydrates that you eat. So there could be a connection. This idea that eggs are dangerous, that fat is dangerous, never had much scientific support, if any. And if we look at it today, if you look at all the evidence that we've collected over the decades, it's sort of worse than ever. If you look at all statistical studies where you try to correlate things, you see no evidence that there is even a correlation that, people who eat a lot of butter, they seem to get the same amount of heart disease as other people. People who avoid it, they get the same amount of heart disease. Doesn't seem to be even a correlation there. And if you look at all the interventional studies where you actually test this, where you randomize people to 2 groups and try to get one group to eat less fat, and then you combine all these studies, you see there is, again, no evidence. The conclusion of this sort of review of all the evidence says that removing SFA, meaning saturated fats, and replacing them with other fats is unlikely to reduce heart disease mortality, or total mortality. And they say that these findings have implications for current dietary recommendations. And the implication, I would say, is that current dietary recommendations are wrong. It's time to change them. So, and that's not just what I'm saying. Of course, a lot of people are saying the same thing now. Even Time magazine put up this cover a couple of years ago saying, "Eat butter." Scientists labeled fat the enemy, why they were wrong. All right, so change of topic. What does keto mean? Keto in keto diet. Well, it means ketogenic, or something that creates ketones. And ketones are these little energy molecules that you would find in the blood of people who eat a very strict low-carb diet. And they have these fancy names, and they're basically energy, just like sugar is energy, or fat can be energy. And the point is that if you stop eating sugar or carbohydrates, the body will switch and eat more and sort of burn more fat, like you could get from these kind of foods. And the body can burn the fat, but the brain cannot burn fat directly. So fat is converted in the liver into these little energy molecules called ketones that fuel the brain. So the entire body becomes fueled mostly by fat. And the brain is a really hungry organ. So if you want to lose weight, if you want to burn fat, it's a great thing. You could actually, just relax and let your brain burn lots of fat for you without even having to work especially hard doing it, of course. I'm not saying that exercise is bad, it's a good thing, but it's nice to have a bonus, sort of. And yeah, this is sort of extra credit if you learn how these can transform into each other and so on. Not necessary. Anyway, so a keto diet, you hear it in the media all the time, and a lot of people are sharing these stories about how they improve their health. This man, Lance, he got rid of his epilepsy, or at least he has it completely under control on a keto diet, also lost weight. Here's another woman who did great, she felt on keto. But it's not really about just stories, because there are a lot of high quality studies done on this. So the best scientific evidence that we can produce at the moment is called a randomized controlled trial, where you, by chance, divide people into two groups, and you let one group learn how to do a low-carb or ketogenic diet, and another group does something else. And then you compare how they do. And there's been dozens of these studies, and the Public Health Collaboration in the UK, they did a review of all these studies to see how many times did the low-carb group actually lose more weight? And how many times, when you compare it to a low-fat group, did they lose more weight? And here's the results. For low-carb, there were 31 studies showing statistically significant more weight loss. On low-fat, there were no studies showing more weight loss. So that's interesting. That seems like a pretty clear winner. And yet, when you look in the media, just earlier this year, you could hear that low-carb diets are actually no better than a traditional focus on fat. That's strange. What about those 31 studies? Well, the thing is that there are also a number of studies where you couldn't find a clear winner. So what happened was we got another study where there was no clear winner. But you can think of it like a football game or whatever. You have one team winning 30 times, and then there is a draw 30 times, and the other team wins never ever. Which team would you bet on? But it's interesting, in the media it's like, okay, low carb wins, we can say that low carb wins, and then when it's a draw, it's low carb does not win. And then it feels like it's 50-50. But it's not really. Of course, if you're scientifically schooled, you know that this is not a sports game, so you're supposed to do it in a different way. You're supposed to combine everything in a systematic meta-analysis, and that's been done many, many times, and basically always showed the same thing. Participants, like in this one from a couple of years ago, participants on low-carb diets experienced a greater reduction in body weight. If you combine all these studies together, you also get some improvement in triglycerides, HDL, but the LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, goes up by about 6 milligrams per deciliter on average. We'll get back to that. It's kind of interesting. So this guy, Peter, he sort of reversed his type 2 diabetes, lost a lot of weight. but maybe his LDL went up by 6 milligrams per deciliter. So should he go back and do what he did before? Or Judy here, she also got off all her diabetes drugs, but maybe her LDL got up by 6 milligrams per deciliter. Or Peter here, Kenneth, another Peter, who also reversed his type 2 diabetes. Pretty impressive. But there is always this sort of thing, could it be dangerous to do this? Would they be better off where they were? And also, the question is this sustainable? Can this last? Because often you hear in the media, sure, low-carb diet works fine for a short time, but in the long term, the weight comes back. So does it? How long can this last? Eric Westman is going to speak tomorrow morning, I think. He did a study about 10 years ago comparing a very low-carb diet to a low glycemic index diet for type 2 diabetes. And after 6 months, the low-carb diet group did a lot better in different ways. So it seems it can work for 6 months. Here's an interesting study about type 2 diabetes that came out this year, done by Verta Health and Sarah Hallberg. A lot better results after 12 months on blood glucose. Also, quite an impressive weight loss curve that you can see here, minus something like 13% of the body weight after a year. It seems to work after a year. Here's a study that is almost 4 years long on type 2 diabetes, where the participants are doing much better after 4 years. So that's pretty good. But there is also this tendency that people often regain weight after a while in these studies on average. So why is that? Here's a common example that people often refer to is in a study from Israel published in the New England Journal of Medicine from 10 years ago. And people were randomized to 3 different diet groups, and what you see here is how much weight they lost on average over 2 years. And the purple line is the low-carb group. They lost the most in the beginning, but then it seems like after about 6 months here, the weight starts going up again. So did it stop working there? Maybe it did. However, when you read the study, you can see that they initially told people to try to stay below 4% of energy from carbohydrates. And then after half a year, they asked people what they ate, and they answered that on average, they were eating 41% carbohydrates. So it seems like it's terribly unfair, but it seems like low-carb diets don't work when you don't eat low-carb. That's really bad, actually. Terrible. So, but the thing is, what you do in these studies is you take people, a large group of people who volunteer to do a weight loss study, but then you roll the dice or something else random, and you divide them into different groups. And in this case, you might be told to eat a low-fat diet or a low-carb diet or a Mediterranean diet, and nobody knows what's best, because that's what the study is going to show. So you're just supposed to eat the way the dice told you to eat for 2 years without anybody telling you that this is the best diet. It's just a diet. So would you do that? Would you go home and faithfully, cook and eat a low-carb diet or a low-fat diet or a Mediterranean diet for a month, every meal? Would you do it for 6 months? Or would you perhaps try to gravitate sort of back to your old habits and forget about that? I think that's what most people do, actually. But back to this question, this terrible unfair thing that once you stop doing it, it stops working. I mean, should we really be surprised about that? Isn't that the case for anything you do when it comes to lifestyle? Like smoking. Let's say you have asthma and you smoke, and someone tells you, if you stop smoking, it's going to be much better for your breathing. and you stop smoking, and yeah, your breathing gets a lot better. But then you start again, and you get back to where you were. Would you then say to people that, I tried that stopping smoking thing? Nah, just works short term, it doesn't work long term. As soon as I started smoking again, the problem came back. You wouldn't say that. How about another silly example? What if you start going to the gym every day and you train super hard and you get lots of muscle and you feel great, and then you stop going to the gym and the muscles start to disappear and you're not as fit anymore? Would you then say that I did try that exercise thing, but it only works short term, doesn't work long term? As soon as I stopped, it stopped working. Or just to make it super silly, what if you try this showering thing and you get all clean, and then you stop showering, and a few days later or a week later, a month later, you're really dirty. It's like, I tried this shower thing, but it's just like they say, it only works short term. If you stop, it doesn't work. Basically, it's the same thing for all lifestyles, right? But for low carb, in the media, and even for a lot of experts, it seems like if people stop doing it and it stops working, it means the diet doesn't work. Sort of like if you would say that showering doesn't work long term, only short term. Because this is what happens in these long-term randomized trials, that people gravitate back to what they had before. However, there is perhaps a way around this. If you go to these studies, like this Hallberg study, where it seems like, hey, this is a weight loss curve, and it's not going up after a year. It just stays down there. But this is not a randomized trial. You haven't had to, roll the dice and follow whatever the dice told you to eat. In this case, people selected themselves. Yes, I want to do this. And the doctors say, this is right for you. This is what we want you to do. This is perfect for you, and we're going to support you in this if you want to do it. And then it seems it can work long term. And we know they actually ate a low carb diet because they tested the ketone levels in the blood, and people had elevated ketones. So we know people were on a low carb diet for a year on average. And it seems if you do it long term, it works long term. Just like exercise or whatever. So how long can it work? Is a long-term cure of type 2 diabetes or obesity possible if you keep doing it? I have some really good experience from my 5 or 8 years perhaps working with patients with this. But I asked someone who has much more experience, Dr. Ted Nyman. He's a family physician from Seattle. And he's been working in the same clinic for 15 years, treating patients with low-carb diets. And he says that he has numerous patients who have cured or totally reversed their type 2 diabetes long-term. And when he says cured, it means that they are off all medications and they have completely normal blood glucose levels for at least a year. And then he sort of removes this diagnosis and says, it's a cure. And that happens, he says, with some regularity. He also told me something else that's kind of interesting. He said that for people who just do a low-carb diet, they, in his experience, they basically have to stay very low-carb forever to keep having this great effect. But if people do a low-carb diet and they add a lot of exercise, then they tend to be able to eat some more carbs and still keep the blood glucose levels normal. So that's interesting, I think. Here's another man, Dr. Jay Wortman. He got type 2 diabetes 16 years ago. And he reversed it on low carb, still off all medications with a normal A1C. Seems like he's doing some exercise though, that picture. So maybe that's it as well. Side effects. Are there any side effects from this? Or is it just perfect. And there are side effects, at least from a strict low-carb diet or ketogenic diet. You can have some common side effects, especially in the first week. But it can happen later as well. So I'm going to go through these briefly. The keto flu, probably a lot of you have experienced that. The first week, people get often headache, feel tired, feel irritable. And often the cure can be to get enough water and salt, because you tend to lose extra fluid and salt in the first week. And this actually can happen after many months and even years as well. Maybe not so much, but if you have a cup of bouillon, for example, extra salt, it usually takes care of this, or most of it. Leg cramps is something that a lot of people can experience, at least in the beginning, also due to a loss of minerals, and again, water, salt, possibly magnesium, usually can take care of it. Constipation can happen, also often due to dehydration, maybe because some people eat less fiber on a low-carb diet. Again, water, salt, fiber, milk of magnesia, if necessary. Most people don't get it, but a few people definitely do. Another thing that can happen is bad breath, or at least ketones in the breath. So that's acetone that can be smelled. It's sort of a fruity smell that can remind people of nail polish remover. So this is something that is most common in the beginning, and it's often temporary, goes away. Breath freshener can be helpful. Some people can have it long term, and then the best idea, if you want to get rid of it, is to eat a bit more carbs, and then it goes away. Of course, the effect of a low-carb diet also gets a little bit less. So you'll have to sort of balance it, if that's the case. But for most people, it's not an issue after maybe first week. Heart palpitations, some people get that, especially in the beginning. Can also be due to dehydration, maybe some stress hormones in the beginning. Usually temporary, water and salt can help. Reduced physical performance, definitely the first couple of weeks, but it can go on for a bit longer. It's usually temporary as the muscles adapt to burning fat for energy instead of sugar. Again, very important to get enough water and salt. And if needed, some targeted carbs before competitions, for example, can be useful. So those are the common side effects, usually initial side effects on low carb. But there are some more that some people might be concerned about, like cholesterol. How about those 6 milligrams? It's usually not an issue, because it's usually no elevation or a very minor elevation. But and the typical thing is actually an improvement where the good cholesterol goes up, which is a really good thing, and triglycerides goes down. So that's just good from a statistical perspective. But a few percent, maybe 5% of people, maybe less, maybe what's called hyper-responders and get a very high level of this LDL. And that is actually something that is currently unknown, whether that is something to be concerned about or not, because it hasn't been studied in this particular circumstance. But just to be safe, or if you're worried about it, there are some ways to mitigate this. Maybe not drink bulletproof coffee, this butter in coffee kind of thing. That can be enough to take care of it. Otherwise, maybe have some less saturated fats and more olive oil, for example. Intermittent fasting can help. And if necessary, if you really want to get your LDL levels down, if you are one of these few people, well, you can always eat more carbs, less fat. But then again, you reduce the effect of a low-carb diet. So that's that. How about this side effect? Can you die from a low-carb diet? Can it shorten your life? You may think so after reading the media. So this is from just a couple of months ago, actually. Low-carb diets could shorten life, studies suggests. All right, what kind of study is this? Because actually all the studies I know of where you actually test a low-carb diet has not, to my knowledge, ever shown that there are more deaths in any group. But this study was not really on people who actually ate low carb, but was on the general population. It's this kind of statistical study where you try to find correlations. The problem with these studies is that they basically cannot say what's cause and effect. You can't know. So you get these statistical correlations. They could be due to anything, really. So to really believe them, they have to be very, very strong. For example, people who smoke get lung cancer about 1,000% more often than people who don't smoke. That's a pretty impressive sort of risk elevation. And I'm inclined to believe that it's actually true. But you sort of need at least a doubling of the risk to really believe it. So how much was the risk elevated here? Actually 1.2, it's a 20% risk increase. It's so small, in fact, that it's very hard to know what it's about. Because these people who eat less carbs, they're actually not following the guidelines. So what else happens? What else is true about people who don't follow guidelines? Well, it turns out that they don't follow other health guidelines either. They smoke more. They don't exercise. They do all kinds of dangerous things. So how do we know that it's because of eating slightly fewer carbs? Not a low-carb diet, but slightly fewer carbs. And the answer is we don't know. There's no way to know. Absolutely not. And in fact, this is the reason why there is so much confusion today with these newspaper headlines saying one thing one day and the complete opposite may seem like the next day. It's because they're all based on these sort of statistical exercises where you can basically find anything and prove whatever you want if you look in the right place. And a lot of people are saying that this is really, really bad science. So this guy, for example, Professor John Ioannidis, he said recently that nutritional epidemiology, which is this kind of science, is a scandal. It should just go to the waste bin. So who is this John? Well, he's the professor of medicine and health research at Stanford University. Also professor of statistics at Stanford University. That's a pretty smart guy, I think. Or this guy, who also knows a thing or two about this, he says, I never believe any headline that says X foodstuff is associated with Y outcomes in health terms, because the science is almost always rubbish. And I think they're right. And we shouldn't believe that kind of science because you can prove anything about anything with that kind of science. But there are real side effects that would have to be balanced between versus the health benefits you may get on a low-carb diet, like weight loss, like reversal of type 2 diabetes, like reversal of high blood pressure, like improvement in PCOS, like improvements in epilepsy, like improvement in IBS. Many things can get better. So then, you'll have to say, I want to try that to see if I can get better. And then you'll see, is it worth it for you? Only you can tell. Here's another thing. Do you need a lot of fancy supplements to do a low-carb or ketogenic diet? Do you need these MCT oils? Do you need ketone supplements? I would say that you don't. There's actually no good evidence of any kind that it would help you, for example, lose weight or reverse diabetes, or even, performance-wise, it's very unclear whether it really helps. We actually did an experiment with some co-workers of mine. 6 people had got to try this placebo-controlled in our office, and we couldn't find any clear benefit. So if there is a benefit, it's not huge, gotta say. And there's no other evidence saying it's great either. So I would just suggest to not waste money on that and buy some great food instead. Much better way to spend your money. That's all you need really, is real food to do this. So getting towards the end, I thought I was just going to share a little bit of my story with low carb. I got really interested in it back in 2002, when I was 2 years out of med school. I was working as a family doctor for a number of years, and the thing that I find fascinating now is I was treating patients, often patients with type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure or obesity, and nobody really got better. So what happened is usually you get a new patient and they're a little bit sicker than last year, and you give them a little bit more drugs and you say bye-bye, and then a year later they come back and you repeat the same thing. But this wasn't, this wasn't strange. It seemed like this is just what everybody was doing. But then I found a few books about low glycemic index diets, and I got really interested in this because it made perfect logical sense to me that this seems like it could work. And yet, everybody says, or most experts said, this is just a fad diet. It's just stupid. So I started reading some science to try to understand this, and that's when I got really hooked, because the science I found seemed to say that this actually does work, and yet nobody is talking about it. So I tried it myself, and hey, it worked for me. I lost, all the excess weight I'd put on since being 20, and my family and friends tried it and worked great. And then I thought, hey, I'm actually going to try this on a few patients, selected patients like people with diabetes, for example. And that's when I got really hooked, because when they came back, suddenly they were like younger, or at least healthier instead of sicker, which is quite a difference. Suddenly I could remove drugs instead of adding drugs. Suddenly, actually, my patients started to bring me gifts, which I think had never happened before, with some regularity. And I think I'm onto something. And I read, actually, Gary Taubes is going to speak after me, and I'd read a few of his things, the New York Times article and the Science article, and I found it super interesting. And then I got his Good Calories, Bad Calories book when it was released, and that's when I really started to understand how everything fit together. I remember reading it, trying to finish a patient quickly, so I could read a few pages of this book, to finish it within a few days. It's a thick book, but I finished it in a few days. And then I thought, hey, I'm going to have to write something in Swedish about this, because not many Swedes are going to be able to get through that book. It's a thick book, and we need something thinner and in Swedish. So I started writing that book, and while I was writing it, I started a blog in Swedish called Kostdoktorn, which means diet doctor in Swedish. And it's been an exciting journey for me. I mean, I didn't really know anything about writing when I started, and a lot of people write better than me, obviously. Also, a lot of people dress better than me, which might be important, because a lot of blogs back then, this is 2007, they were about the sort of daily outfits of the person writing. So this is Kinsa. She's the most famous blogger in Sweden, the one with the most visitors. So I thought, hey, if I do the same thing, I'm going to get lots of visitors. That was a bit of a failed experiment, actually, so it didn't work. I had to go back to writing about what I knew about boring stuff, like diet and health and stuff. But still, after a month, there were 500 people visiting every day. And I thought, wow, this is pretty fantastic. Instead of talking to one person at a time, I get to speak to 500 people. How great. And a year later, 5,000. And a few years later, 50,000 people a day in Swedish. So yeah, that was an exciting journey. So I started going to these conferences, meeting these great people like Gary, like Eric, other people, and learning more about this. And then I thought, hey, there's really nothing great in English. This is back in 2011. There's lots of great things now. But I thought, I'm going to start an English site as well. So I did. It's called Diet Doctor. And a few years ago, we were a few people working part-time or freelance doing this. And I had to sort of make a decision because I was working in this health clinic still part-time, seeing one patient at a time, which is fantastic. Still some of the most gratifying experiences of my life, seeing what people manage to do on a low-carb diet. But one person at a time, if you think that maybe there's a way to help 10 people in that time, maybe 100 people, maybe potentially thousands of people. So after thinking about this for years, I decided I'm actually gonna quit this job and only do the online thing, at least for a while, to see if it works. So I did that, and yeah, I don't think I've regretted it really. I miss it sort of, but it's been even more exciting because instead of 50,000 people, now it's like 400,000 people per day. And yeah, we started this membership to support it because we didn't want to have ads or sell products. So we stopped doing all that and only had this voluntary optional membership, which is like Netflix or Spotify, where you get a free month if you like, and if you stay, it's $9 a month after that. Now we got over 50,000 people supporting us. So instead of, and we're using everything to build this company to do great and exciting things. So instead of a few people working part-time, now we're 40 people working with this, 23 people full-time. It's really exciting to me to see what we can hopefully do together. This is a fantastic team that have joined this thing. And so this has made it possible to produce lots of free resources online. You don't have to join, you can just use this. For example, free guides to low carb and keto, free news. Hey, cardiologist in Houston Chronicle. And it's not Nadir. Who could it be? He's going to be here too. It's Brett Scher. He's going to speak as well. Yes, and it's in Spanish. Do you know anybody who speaks Spanish? It's now in Spanish. So, and there's hundreds, well, 600, 700, I think, recipes online. This is the most popular recipe, which is ironic, I guess. The second most popular recipe, can it be? Yes, pizza. There's no flour, only almond flour, actually. 600 success stories, with amazing stories that people have sent. These visual guides that you can check out, you know, what kind of vegetables are low carb or keto. All of this stuff, by the way, is free. How many people are doctors in here? Can you raise your hand? Quite a few people. So we're building this resource, a free resource for doctors who want to learn how to do low carb in a safe and effective way. So you can use it. We have a video series with this amazing gentleman, Dr. David Unwin from the UK, teaching you how to do low carb safely and effectively with your patients. Yeah, Eric Westman, Sarah Hallberg, and other people are also there teaching healthcare professionals how to do this. And lots of videos for other people as well. Let's see. And yes, and meal plans and shopping lists, etc., etc. leaflets to print, if you like. And really, this is what it is all about. I'm going to show you a little video of what can happen.
My energy increased. I was able to sleep.
I got off the medications that I had been on for 20 plus years for high blood pressure.
2014, beginning of 2015, I was off all my medications.
That hunger that I had for my entire life wasn't there.
Her energy level, and much like mine, our mental well-being has improved as much as our physical health.
I went from 374 pounds to 139 pounds.
I lost 200 pounds in roughly 18 months.
The real freedom was the emotional freedom, you know, not having to crave and not having these blood sugar dips and spikes.
I now take 0 medication, and I was on 4 different types of tablets, maybe 6 tablets a day.
I feel like work-wise, I can be more focused on projects and get through projects better.
I feel absolutely free of IBS now. It's good.
My life was transformed by it.
I would have never believed that within my lifespan, I would have my life back like this.
It's pretty amazing. I just want to mention that Stephen Bennett, who's in the theater, was in that video. Thank you, Stephen. 2.5 years ago. Still looking fantastic. So just going to say before I end, though, that a low carb or a keto diet, it's not for everybody. Not everybody needs it, clearly not. And not everybody wants to do a low carb or ketogenic diet. It can be hard to do. But it can also be really powerful in certain situations, like for weight loss, like for type 2 diabetes reversal, like for high blood pressure and certain other conditions. So if you're interested in this, if you want to learn more, if you want to start a low carb diet, or if you want to make it simpler to keep doing it, I hope that we can make it simpler for you. Thank you. So I don't know if we have time for a few questions or if it's Gary time, maybe.
We have 10 minutes for questions.
So how do we do the questions?
So the questions, you can come up to the
microphone.
You can come up to the microphone right up there. You can line up and ask questions.
All right, the other side.
While they're circling back up here, Bill Amonette has made sure that we have keto pizza with the same recipe from dietdoctor.com.
Fantastic. Famous fathead pizza, it's by Tom Norton. Yes, a lot of people know that.
Bill, go ahead.
Seems to work. You early on showed a graph where you had healthiest outcomes for like Sweden and Italy and Switzerland. So my question is, how have you been able to influence the guidelines for schools and government workers and things like that in Sweden?
Oh, how we have been able to implement the guidelines in Sweden. Unfortunately, the guidelines in Sweden are very, very similar to the guidelines everywhere, the official dietary recommendations. It's basically the same. We're just copying you guys. So I think it's all right. So I think what's going to happen or has to happen for the rest of the world to change is for Washington to change. So, which is a hard thing to do, but it will happen eventually. It's just a question of, is it going to take 5 years or 50 years? Nina Seychelles, of course, is working hard to make sure it's 5 years. So if you want to support that, you can go to the nutritioncoalition.com or .org and sign up as a supporter. I think they can really do great things to make it happen much faster.
Yeah, I'm a physician, and I'm reading a lot about the microbiome, and with this radical change of diet, you'd wonder about the microbiome changing very much in this. Has anyone looked into the possibility that some of these things are actually changes in the patient's microbiome?
Mm-hmm. So what happens to the microbiome if you eat a low-carb diet?
Yes.
So I mean, every dietary change is gonna change the microbiome. I think it's a lot about eating a varied diet. If you want to have a sort of many different kinds of bacteria in your gut, you may want to have quite a varied diet, and you may want to eat plenty of vegetables in that case, like non-starchy vegetables. You could still do a low-carb diet and have a lot of nice bugs in your stomach. If you think that's important, I mean, it's still controversial.
Yeah, the fact that it works for IBS is very interesting. That would be a big factor in that. Anyway.
Yeah, so it works. It seems to work quite well for IBS, and maybe it's because a lot of people eat less fiber, which can actually be a good thing for some people if they have problem with gas and cramping and so on. If you eat less fiber, some people get better. It can be worth trying. Even if it's the opposite again of common advice. Yes?
I'm a pediatrician, and I do see this obesity just going crazy. We do screen everything, but then again, are there any studies in pediatric population that I can apply the same thing for them?
Are there any studies for pediatric populations? There are a couple of studies at least. I think people are like 12 or above or something like that. I can give you the links to those studies, randomized controlled trials showing a good effect. So down to that sort of age group, there are good studies. Younger than that, I don't think there are, except for epilepsy studies and so on.
I see from 4-year-old, 95 percentile, 99 percentile BMI. So your website is great. So is there a way I can use it from my website, a link, so that they can go and
Oh, sure. If you want a link from your website to Diet Doctor, feel free to do so.
Okay, I'll talk to you.
That's great.
Okay.
Let's talk more.
Thank you.
Hello, Eric.
Thank you, Andreas. I'm Dr. Eric Westman at Duke University, and wow. So one guideline has changed, and that's the Obesity Medicine Association guideline. It's the largest group of doctors who treat obesity and diabetes, or specifically obesity, but we treat diabetes as well. That guideline has included the keto diet in it. And you were invited to our meeting just last month, I believe it was, and you were on the panel with Dr. Osner from Miami, a cardiologist there. I wonder what your impressions were. There are lots of changes occurring among doctors in the US, and you don't have to wait for the governmental guideline to change what you eat, is what I got from your talk here. But what were your impressions of coming to our meeting in DC?
Thank you, Eric, for inviting me. I think it was great. I really enjoyed. So that was a conference, I think 800 people, mostly doctors, very, very friendly reception, I feel. And dozens and dozens of doctors coming up saying that they use low carb with their patients who have obesity to treat obesity with great effect. So I do think things are starting to change. And those people are doctors who are specialized in obesity treatment. And a lot of them know that low carb is possibly the most effective diet to do that. Seems like.
Hello, doctor. I'm Patty McGoy, and I'm a community member and a patient of Dr. Ali's. My question for you is, how sustainable is keto eating? Because it's like eating from the top of the food chain. And what if we get 7 billion people on the planet all looking for grass-fed beef?
It's a great question. I would start by saying I don't think 7 billion people need to eat a keto diet, fortunately. It's more of a diet that is meant for people who need it for health reasons. Secondly, I would say that it's not necessary to eat more meat to eat a keto diet. The important thing is to switch from eating a lot of carbohydrates to eating more energy from fat. So the protein or the meat can stay the same or even go down. You know, some people eat a vegetarian keto diet, and that's possible. Thirdly, I would say it's really a lot about how we produce meat, how we raise our animals and treat them. You know, if sure, you know, 7 billion people cannot eat grass-fed meat, but they don't need to either. You know, it doesn't have to be for 7 billion people. It just has to be for the people who benefit from it the most. So, yeah, all those things. You know, keto is for the people who need it, not for everybody. Most people can keep eating carbs and do fairly fine as long as they avoid the worst carbs and processed food. I think it can work. And then really working hard at like regenerative agriculture, spreading that to more places. Actually, animals that graze on grass and walk around, they tend to result in actually reduced global warming effect because carbon gets bound into thicker and thicker soils because of, you know, what cows do when they walk around. So the soil sort of builds up. I think you're going to hear all about it.
Just one last question, please.
Yes.
One last.
Hi, Andreas. I'm Gigi from Norway. So I have a question. Why is it so much focus on low carb for treating type 2 diabetes and not type 1 when it clearly helps for type 1 also? My son has type 1 and we have reduced our carbohydrates in the whole family, very much inspired by you and Dietdoktoren. And it really has helped us to get an easier life with diabetes.
Yes, so why the big focus on type 2 and not type 1 when it can help stabilize blood sugar levels and reduce other issues in type 1? I think you're right. I think it's going to be huge in type 1 diabetes as well. One of the reasons, I guess, is just that there are so many more people with type 2 diabetes, like 10 times more people. Doesn't mean that a person with type 1 diabetes is any less important, but 10 people is perhaps more important than one person to start with. Also, I think people with type 1 diabetes doesn't necessarily have to stay on a keto diet. Some do great, and some want to, but some can control their blood glucose levels with a moderate amount of carbs as well. So I think it should definitely be an option, and people should learn about it and know about it.
Because they don't have to take so much insulin.
Yes, you can take less insulin. So I think it's a great option for a lot of people if people want to do it. And at least they should have that as an option.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Andreas. So there's 3 quick things is that for microbiome, please talk with Amber Owen. For environmental sustainability of eating meat, Peter Ballestad is there. And for the diabetes question, we have Jake Kushner out here. So with that, I want to introduce one of my heroes. I'm truly humbled that he came here because back in the early 2000s, when the Atkins movement was nearly dead, the person who revived it is Gary Taubes with his investigative journalism. And if he had not done that, if he had not shown the passion, many of us would not be here. So for that, I owe a depth of gratitude to him, and so do all of us. So with that, Gary Taubes.
Thank you. Thank you. Still don't know how to accept that. The crutch is me listening to a surgeon. I don't think it's diet related. You would think after all these years that I would know better than to listen to a doctor. When he smiled at me and said, "We can fix that." Surgeons, I don't know, man. Anyway, so let me give you a little background. I want to segue to something that Andreas said in his talk, which was interesting. This latest paper that said that the low-carb diet is no better nor worse than a low-fat diet. What's interesting is when I got into this field in the late 1990s, early 2000s, the logic was that we should all eat calorie-restricted low-fat. Well, the low-fat diet was the only healthy diet. If you're overweight, you eat a calorie-restricted low-fat diet, and a low-carbohydrate diet will kill you. That's what we were dealing with, okay? There was Atkins, it was quackery, everyone was taught that in medical school. And if nothing else, 18 years later, we've gotten to the point where now you can get news if a study shows that a low-fat diet is no worse than a low-carb diet. So now equality is considered news. And we have, when I started in this business, there were maybe a dozen physicians in the United States prescribing these diets, and half of them had written diet books. And today there's from thousands to tens of thousands of physicians around the world who have bought in. And what's interesting is they've all had experiences very similar to Andreas. And in 1998, Malcolm Gladwell wrote an article in the New Yorker called The Pima Paradox on the obesity epidemic back when it was new, and he talked about what he called the conversion narrative, which Malcolm regrettably made a little fun of, because he said this was in every diet book. There's a physician, he's overweight, nothing works for him, he does a little research, he finds some secret diet, he tries it, it works, and then he tries it on his patients and it works for them, and then he writes a diet book. And the problem is, if you're lean in America, and you're doing what the doctors have told you to do, and you're following the dietary advice, you have nothing to learn. It appears to be working for you, and it works for people you know, and you assume if, okay, I'm lean, I eat in moderation, I exercise, therefore if everyone eats in moderation and everyone exercises, they will be lean too. You have to be overweight. You have to struggle with your weight. A phrase that the old-time diet doctors use is you have to fatten easily. And for those of us who fatten easily, we're the ones who get fat eating the healthy diet. We're not out there at McDonald's guzzling Coca-Colas and 4 quarter-pounders with cheese. We eat what healthy people eat, what lean people eat, and it makes us fat. So we're the ones who go looking for something else. And if you find it, you become passionate about it. If it works for your patients, you become passionate about it. So it's funny, Malcolm Gladwell and I basically did the same thing about 3 years apart. He wrote this article in the New Yorker in which he said the conventional wisdom says you should eat a low-fat diet and eat less, exercise more, and the diet book doctors say something different. And God knows anyone who questions the medical orthodoxy is probably doing a reasonably good job. But in that case, Malcolm sided with the medical orthodoxy. I came along 3 years later with a slightly different background, and by the time I came around, there were people like Eric Westman who had patients who had gone on Atkins, and Eric was open-minded enough that when a patient went on Atkins and lost 25 pounds and his lipids improved, he said, that's interesting. I got to look into this. And then, so by the time I came along, people like Eric and about 5 other research groups in the US had already done clinical trials showing that the conventional wisdom just seemed to be wrong. There was something profoundly wrong because you compare a low-fat American Heart Association diet, calorie restricted, with a low-carb, high-saturated fat, high-animal product diet in these clinical trials where you get to eat as much food as you want, you just don't eat carbohydrates. And the conventional wisdom tells us that this diet that's full of saturated fat and animal products should kill us, should make our lipids go crazy. And the conventional wisdom, the theory of obesity says that if you eat a diet unrestricted in calories, you should get fatter, right? Because fat people get fat to begin with because they eat too much. That's the conventional thinking. And then in all of these clinical trials, all 5 of them, when I did my first New York Times Magazine article, the low-carb diet did better. Not just did people lose more weight on this diet, but their heart disease and diabetes risk factors improved. And I just happen to be one of the few people who said if there's 5 clinical trials, all showing the same thing, all contradicting the conventional wisdom, maybe the conventional wisdom is wrong. And that launched me into an investigation, the gist of which I'm going to talk about today. So again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nutritionist or a dietitian. Was an investigative journalist who's become, I don't know, somebody who eats low-carb diets. Disclosures, I get book royalties, honorary. Actually, CrossFit, bless their hearts, has been supporting me recently, which has allowed me to afford good health insurance so I could have my knee fixed. But I can't be seen. It's interesting. I'm very careful not to go out. I have all this CrossFit gear. And I never go out with my crutches and my CrossFit gear because it could be a public relations disaster. So just like somebody would blame the knee on the diet, they'll blame the knee on CrossFit. Okay, so here's the context of all of what we're talking about. This tends to be a discussion about which diet we should eat. Should we eat our diet or their diet? But while we're discussing this, obesity rates have exploded, as Andreas demonstrated, and diabetes rates have exploded. And we have these epidemics on our hand. They're tragic epidemics. They're going on worldwide. Everywhere in the world where populations are eating Western diets, they are experiencing this in diabetes incidence. And in fact, the Director General of the World Health Organization just about 2 years ago in Washington gave a keynote address at the National Academy of Sciences annual meeting, and she gave a prediction for what the odds were that health organizations like the World Health Organization would curb this epidemic, not reverse it, but prevent it from getting worse. And a prediction of the likelihood of that happening was 0%. Complete and total acknowledgement of complete and total failure of the medical organizations to control these epidemics. So under those circumstances, what you want to do is ask a simple question. Do we understand the disease that we're trying to control? You know, if lung cancer rates had continued to go up from the 1990s onward, if HIV rates had continued to go up from the 1980s onward, if 30% of Americans had HIV right now, you would question the logic that HIV causes, or 30% had AIDS, you would question the logic, does HIV cause AIDS, and is it a sexually transmitted disease, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there would be teams of scientists in white suits with devices like Ghostbusters walking around every hallway trying to figure out what we don't understand about this disease. And in terms of obesity and diabetes, we don't do that, despite the fact that they're associated with every major chronic disease. So if you get heavier, your risk of getting every major chronic disease, every major killer in the US increases. So this is probably is the single largest driver in health food costs. And the reason we don't do anything about this, the reason we don't have these teams of scientists trying to figure out what went wrong, the reason we have people like lone investigative journalists and isolated doctors around the world is because we have a belief system about the cause of these diseases. The idea is type 2 diabetes is driven by excess weight. And excess weight, adiposity, obesity is caused by this. Okay? It's an energy imbalance between calories consumed and calories expended. So when I started my research, this is what I believe. This is a conventional thinking. There's a line in my infamous New York Times Magazine article that says, of course, obesity is caused by taking in more calories than you expend. This is a line you see often in medical journals talking about obesity. Recently, they've tried to jazz it up. They'll say obesity is an energy balance homeostasis disorder, thinking if they throw in another multisyllabic word, it'll give it more. Calories in, calories out. That's the theory. We overeat. Fundamentally, we overeat. And you have to explain, one of the things you want to do in science, in the course of my research, I was always kind of all of my investigative science journalism was studying this, what physicists used to call pathological science, which is the science of things that aren't. So it's science gone bad, or bad science. And just like there are bad plumbers you don't want to hire to fix your toilet, there are bad scientists out there. I think more and more every year, just as there are more and more scientists. So I've become a historian of science and a philosopher of science in the course of my research, all amateur. Ultimately, what you want to do in science is explain the observations. So it's not just explaining why people get fatter. You want to explain the obesity epidemic, and you end up doing this with this idea that too much food and too little physical activity cause overeating and energy in greater than energy out. You end up with obesity and the obesity epidemic. Okay, we've gotten more prosperous. As we've gotten more prosperous, there's more food available. As there's more food available, we eat more of it. And we become more physically inactive. What am I pointing this at? Anyway, key is it's a hypothesis. It's not chiseled on stone tablets and passed down from the mountaintop. It's a hypothesis, and what any good scientist should do is ask, what is the data to support it? And that's all I did as an investigative science reporter, is I started going to look for the data, and it turns out it's not just a hypothesis, it's a hypothesis with a very specific history. Okay, and all hypotheses come from a particular period in time when there's particular equipment available to study the science. And in this case, modern nutrition science begins in the late 1860s in Germany with the invention of room-sized devices called calorimeters that allowed, they were biochemists back then, they became nutritionists, to study the amount of energy expended by a full-size living being, like an animal, a dog, or a human. You could put them in a room, you could measure the carbon dioxide they put out, the oxygen they take in, and from that you could calculate their energy expenditure. And once you could calculate their energy expenditure, you could figure out how much energy they were taking in by burning the foods they ate in something called a bomb calorimeter. And now you could study energy in and energy out. And this begins in the 1860s in Germany. So for the next 50 years, all of nutrition science is what they could study, what the tools available allowed them to study. Because the tools available tell you what you could learn, and that determines what questions you could ask, and the questions you ask determine the answers you get. So they could study calories in and calories out. They could study the vitamin and mineral contents and the fiber content and the protein content and the ash content in the foods. And when you look back at the histories of nutrition, that's all there was. And the only ones that seem relevant to obesity was this calories thing. And while they were doing it, these two researchers, there's the birth of modern science, the first calorimeter in 1866, and then as they were doing it, the physics community and the chemists were working out the laws of thermodynamics, which are basically the laws of how energy transforms in systems. And they showed that the laws of thermodynamics hold for humans. They showed that it's true for living organisms. And in the early 1900s, this German diabetes specialist named Karl von Norden, for the first time ever, sort of puts forth with a theory of obesity in which he's basically saying it's caused by simply taking in more energy than we expend. The ingestion of a quantity of food greater than that required by the body leads to an accumulation of fat and to obesity, should the disproportion be continued over a period of time. And then this University of Michigan physiologist, MD Louis Newberg, comes along. And Newberg was an interesting character. He did some very good work in diabetes, and then he did some terrible work in obesity. And he has a revelation, because up until now, there's questions about maybe there are people who, really fatten so easily that even if you try to starve them, they still tend to hold on to fat or put on fat. And working on the research from a German pediatrician named Hilda Bruck, Newberg concluded that all obese persons are alike in one fundamental respect: they literally overeat. Okay, this is true, and we'll get to why it's true. And then from there, he said obesity is caused by either a perverted appetite, which is eating too much, or a lessened outflow of energy. So this idea that obesity is an energy balance disorder begins with von Norden, and then Newberg takes it over in the United States beginning in the 1930s. And the problem is there was this sort of a fundamental problem. There's always a fundamental problem with this energy balance idea, even in the modern variations, which is if you get fat because you eat too much or you exercise too little, then why don't you, once you know that, why don't you change? I mean, it's conscious control. Don't eat so much, exercise more. Those are always the questions people are asking us. And Newberg's answer was interesting. So the question is, why don't obese people compensate by eating less or exercising more? And the answer, says Newberg, is they suffer from various human weaknesses such as overindulgence and ignorance. So normally I don't show photos of researchers. I don't even like to describe researchers when my books. I showed the photo of Newberg because it's interesting. Again, if you're lean, it's natural to assume, like, I'm lean and I eat in moderation and I exercise. They probably didn't back then. So I'm lean, I eat in moderation. Therefore, if everyone was lean, they would eat if everyone ate in moderation, they would be lean too. That's the natural way to think about it. I mean, this room is full of people who think we eat low-carb diets, we're lean. If everyone ate low-carb diets, they would be lean too. It's a natural perspective to have. Perspective is everything. The problem is if people aren't lean, and you're telling them to eat in moderation, they're clearly not trying hard enough, or they're too stupid to know that they should be listening to you, or there's something else wrong with their behavior and therefore their mind, and you're led directly to this idea of various human weaknesses. So you start with this idea that obesity is an energy balance disorder, and you end up putting the cause of the problem in the head. Ignorance, self-indulgence, gluttony, and sloth, and basically one of the reasons I hate this calories in, calories out energy balance idea. It's sort of my role model here is Ahab, and it's my white whale, is because of what it ultimately does. There's no way to get around this idea that if you're overweight or obese, it's somehow a behavioral failing, and if it's a behavioral failing, it's in your head. And there's a whole field of modern neurobiology that basically takes this same idea and puts the cause of the problem in the head. So the CNS is hypothesized, the central nervous system is hypothesized to regulate body fat mass via coordinate adjustments of both intake and expenditure in response to afferent long-term and short-term signals. So you end up with, these are the causes, this is the site of the problem, and there's nothing going on down here that actually suggests that if you were to ask the question, why do people fatten easily? Because that's what we're dealing with, then the problem might be something with the metabolism of fat in the human body. We move fat around in a variety of ways. We burn it, we store it, there's a whole beautiful homeostatic system that evolved to make sure that we always have fuel available. And we're never discussing that in this system. We're always discussing problems with the brain. So there are a lot of shortcomings in the energy balance hypothesis, and they're easy to find. That's the problem. So for starters, forget fat because we eat too much, then eating less should work. So you can say, well, sure, it doesn't work. I mean, my friend is 300 pounds. She tries to eat less. She gets down to 290, and then she falls off the diet, what Andreas talked about with the shower and cigarette problem. But we don't start off 200 pounds overweight or 100 pounds overweight or 50 pounds overweight. We start off a few pounds overweight. And then we become 10 pounds overweight. At some point along the line, we notice that we're letting our belt out, or our friends, when we're children, start making fun of us, or something goes on, and we should be able to, at that point, reverse the process. And there's no evidence that it can be done. And clinical trials show that when in clinical trials, the results are clinically insignificant. Hilda Bruck, the German pediatrician who was the leading authority in pediatric obesity in the mid-20th century, put it this way. She said, more than any other illness, a physician treating the obese patient is called upon only to do a special trick to make the patient do something, stop eating, after it has already been proved that he cannot do it. Everyone knows you're supposed to eat less. If people remain obese, if there's an obesity epidemic, clearly at least telling people to eat less doesn't work. The question is, does actually eating less doesn't work? And there's precious little evidence to show that it does for anything more than a very short period of time. The interesting thing is the flip side. This is a balance, eating less, exercising more, intake and expenditure. The problem is that there's precious little evidence to show that exercise, increasing your energy expenditure, leads to weight loss. Okay, we all do it. If you go to the gym and you look at the number of calories expended on the elliptical machine and you got some target you're going for before you get off, you believe that you can reduce your weight or at least maintain your weight by increasing energy expenditure. And there are meta-analyses that show how tiny to non-existent this effect is in clinical trials. They're surprisingly hard to do, clinical trials, because if you tell one group to exercise and one group not to, you've got an unequal intervention, and the people who exercise are likely to change their diet in response to the fact that they're now exercising. But I found this evidence the most compelling. This is an American Heart Association, American College of Sports Medicine joint report on physical activity guidelines. This is a dozen of the leading experts in the country on physical activity on health, and they're people who you would expect to spin the evidence in favor of physical activity. That's what you do in these guidelines. And these are people who all believe that physical activity is an inherent part of a healthy lifestyle, as do I. And yet this is what they said about this idea that increasing energy expenditure through exercise should lead to weight loss. They said it's reasonable to assume that persons with relatively high daily energy expenditures would be less likely to gain weight over time compared with those who have low energy expenditures, which is the logical equivalent of saying if I'm overweight and I'm a couch potato, I'd be less likely to gain weight over time if I become a marathon runner than if I remain a couch potato. And then they say, so far data to support this hypothesis are not particularly compelling. And the point is, this hypothesis is at least 100 years old. And after 100 years, the best you could say about a hypothesis is the data to support it are not particularly compelling. You should seriously consider the possibility that it's just wrong. Doesn't matter if you're lean and run marathons. The fact is, there's precious little evidence that you could take an obese person, get him to run a marathon, and you'll end up with a lean person. I always think about this, it's like the world is full of greyhounds who think that if they could get basset hounds to run around the track enough, they could turn the basset hounds into greyhounds. And the reality is what you end up with is our emaciated, exhausted basset hounds. You don't get greyhounds. Those people are different than us. And that's what they don't understand, and it's hard for them to understand. They think we're identical. People who fatten easily and people who don't are the same people. The only difference is we eat too much and they don't. And that's simply not true. By the way, I am maintaining a 40-pound weight loss, okay? 15 pounds is probably the surgery, so I'm not sure that's good. But the rest, so when I say, I understand what it means to fatten easily. I don't fatten as easily as a lot of people, but I fatten easier than a lot of people. Okay. Actually, let me skip this for 1 second. I'm going to just tell you a quick way to think about this. To me, we should put an end to this whole discussion, by the way. Imagine when you saw the invitation to come talk today and there's a dinner tonight, and you were invited to come not just to the talk, but also to the dinner after the talk, and the dinner's at Nadir's house, and it's a banquet. And it's not just a banquet, it's the banquet with the 12 best chefs in the Houston area. We'll throw in Galveston, too. It's like Top Chef on steroids, okay? You know the end of Top Chef when they end, you get to taste all the different food, but there's going to be enormous amounts of courses and food, the likes of which you've never seen. And the invitation to the banquet says, bring your appetite, come hungry. What would you do to assure that when you got to Nadir's house tonight, you were able to eat as much food as humanly possible? Okay, I could take votes from the audience. I'm going to suggest two possibilities. One, you're going to eat less during the day, right? Skip snacks, smaller portions, walk away hungry. And the other thing you might do is exercise more. If you weren't going to work out, you're certainly going to work out. If you were going to work out, you might double your workout, and you might even say, Nadir only lives 5 miles from here, let's walk. Remember the concept of building up an appetite? It used to be you exercise to build up an appetite. Back in the 60s, you could actually find articles where doctors are recommending that people should play 18 holes of golf so that they'll eat more. Okay, but what we did is we took the two things that any reasonably sane human being would do to assure they were hungry, and we turned it into advice to obese people to lose weight. And then when it makes them hungry too, and they fall off the wagon or binge eat in response, we blame them for not having willpower or for being ignorant and gluttons and sloths, etc. It's crazy. And yet this is the conventional wisdom in America. This is, okay. So my apologies, I'm going to show some photos of naked human beings. I should have warned you. These are from pre-World War II European textbooks, okay? I'm going to give you a theory of obesity shortly that was formed in pre-World War II Germany and Austria. And they thought it was important to actually look at obese people, not just to measure whether the BMI is over 30 or under 30, but to look at how you're studying the process of fat accumulation. You want to know why and how do people accumulate excess fat? That's the question that we need an answer to. And so to do that, you have to look at people and see not just where they accumulate fat, but when they accumulate fat. And maybe you'll start to learn different things about the accumulation of fat that'll talk about this connection with diet and lifestyle. So for starters, we know obesity has a huge genetic component. It's as much as height or eye color or anything else. Obesity runs in families. So here's a photo of a lean pair of identical twins and an obese pair of identical twins. And these twins practice perfect energy balance. And these twins, not so perfect. But the question is, maybe these twins ate too much and these twins don't, but why do they have the exact same body fat distribution? So body types run in families just as well as facial, it's not just the faces that are identical, it's the body types that are identical. What regulates that? Because surely calories in and calories out have nothing to say about that matter. Even if we grant that these people took in more calories than they expended, which they clearly did until they got this fat, why is their fat distribution identical? What regulates that? Men and women fatten differently. Okay, men gain fat above the waist, women gain fat below the waist. The man, by getting fat above the waist, doubled his risk of heart disease. The woman, by getting fat below the waist, did not. What's regulating that? Clearly sex hormones are involved. But with the calories, how much they eat and exercise says nothing about where the fat goes. So puberty is a classic example. Boys and girls enter puberty with roughly the same amount of body fat on their bodies. The boys go through puberty, they get taller and they get heavier, which means they're taking in more calories than they expend, and they lose fat and gain muscle. And the girls go through puberty and they gain fat in very specific places. And when they come out of puberty, they have 50% more fat on their bodies than boys. Okay, so puberty for girls is what the researchers would call an obesogenic phenomenon. But what controls that? How much they eat and exercise? We know they took in more calories than they expended because they got taller and heavier, they got more massive. That's a given. Why did the boys lose fat and gain muscle and the girls gain fat? And why in specific places? And clearly sex hormones are determining that. So we know that hormones play a huge role in fat accumulation. The question is, what other kind of roles do they play? So this whole energy balance idea comes from physics. This laws of thermodynamics, energy conservation. This is the first law of thermodynamics. It's the simplest one to understand. It basically says, remember, energy is neither created nor destroyed. So if a system gets more massive, it means more energy entered it than left it. So for instance, if this room gets more crowded, it means more people entered than left. We don't create people out of nothing. They're not beamed in from the Starship Enterprise. More people must have walked in the door than left. That's all this says. Okay, but what we do is we take this energy balance equation that's still in papers today. Delta E is a change of energy in a system is equal to the energy in minus the energy out. And we say change of energy is effectively change in fat mass, and E in is energy consumed, and E out is energy expended. And then we do a crazy thing. This says if the energy of a system increases, more energy expended came in than left, and if this is negative, it means more energy left than came in. There's no arrow of causality here. So by that I mean what we do is we say, well look, clearly if somebody eats more and they don't exercise more, they don't compensate, then delta E is going up. Therefore, eating more is a cause of fat accumulation. Or if they become sedentary and they don't compensate by dropping their energy in, then delta E is going to go up. Therefore, being sedentary causes fat accumulation. But there's no causality there. It's a correlation issue like we talked about. It's a tautology. It's a tautology. You know what a tautology is? So remember this. The fundamental cause of obesity and overweight is an energy imbalance between calories consumed and calories expended. Okay, it seems reasonable when you see that on the World Health Organization website. But imagine the World Economic Forum saying the fundamental cause of wealth is a money imbalance between dollars earned and dollars spent. Okay, this is what I mean by a tautology. So if you ask me, like if this, instead of talking about obesity and chronic disease and diabetes, this was a finance seminar and you want to know how to get rich, and you said, Gary, what makes people wealthy? And I said, well, they make more money than they spend. If you have any sense, you leave the room, and if you're paying me, you fire me. But if I'm an obesity guy, I could say, why do people get fat? Well, they take in more energy than they expend, and that's conventional wisdom. And if I say anything else, I'm a quack who doesn't believe in the laws of thermodynamics. Dollars in are greater than dollars out. Climate change, the atmosphere appears to be heating up. But we don't see the International Panel on Climate Change saying the fundamental cause of global warming is an energy imbalance between energy entering the atmosphere and energy leaving it. And the funny thing is, we know that more energy is entering the atmosphere than leaving it because the atmosphere is heating up, assuming you believe it is, which I do. But it's a tautology. If somebody's getting fatter, they're taking in more energy and they expand. It says absolutely nothing about the cause of the disease. It's the single biggest mistake in the past century of medical science. It's an 8th grade mathematics and science mistakes. Any of you have 8th graders, they should be able to tell what's wrong with this idea that it's an energy balance disease. And it's a conventional wisdom, and I'm stunned by it. And it's conventional wisdom that comes with all these implications about behavior. So it turns out there was an alternative hypothesis. I knew nothing about this when I started my research, nothing at all. It's a simple hypothesis. You start with a very simple statement. You don't say obesity is an energy balance disorder. That's an assumption. Obesity is a fat accumulation disorder. Somebody comes into your office, or you look in the mirror, and you say that person has too much fat. You don't know how much they eat, how much they exercise, and you don't care. What they have is an excess accumulation of fat. It's a fat accumulation disorder. The question is, what regulates fat accumulation? This hypothesis, gluttony and sloth are compensatory effects. They're not causes. So we changed the direction of causality. Now, I said there is no causality, but in the conventional wisdom, we assume that if you change intake and expenditure, you'll change energy balance. So these are the causes, and this is the effect. And in this other hypothesis, the alternative hypothesis, we assume that the fat on the human body, like everything else, is very well regulated. So if you dysregulate it to cause fat accumulation to occur, you're going to have compensatory effects on how hungry somebody gets and how much physical activity they have. So if you stash energy in the fat tissue that they can't use to burn their body, they're going to have to increase to run their body, they're going to have to increase their intake. So they're going to get hungry. So the question is, what regulates all that? Okay. I probably don't have time for this. So let's skip our Gedanken experiment. This alternative hypothesis was a German hypothesis. It was pre-World War II. One of the things I learned doing my research, which I should not have had to learn because I had come out of the physics world, but pre-World War II, all the best science in the world, most of the best science in the world was being done in Germany and Austria. If you think about the most famous physicists from prior to the Second World War, they're all people like Schrödinger and Planck, Einstein, Germans, thank you, mostly Jews. Pre-World War II, German was the lingua franca of medicine. If you wanted to be a serious medical researcher, you had to at least be able to read German so you could read the German language journals. Ideally, you spoke German also so you could travel to Germany and Austria and learn from the Herr Professor doctors who were considered the world leaders, who had inherited this culture of science. They knew how to do a science in a way that, frankly, the Americans didn't. And what happened with World War II is, in fields like physics, where we had bombs to build, we had this influx of European researchers who, in effect, if you look at the Manhattan Project, it was dominated by German and Austrian and European Jews who wanted to build the bomb to stop Hitler. In medicine and public health and nutrition, we wanted nothing to do with these people. And there are actually protocols in place that kept these people from getting jobs in Ivy League universities, which sounds vaguely familiar if you're Asian American today. Okay, the two leading authorities on this hypothesis, Gustav von Bergmann was the leading German authority in clinical medicine in the first half of the 20th century. Today, the most prestigious prize in the German Society for Internal Medicine is the Gustav von Bergmann Medal. And Julius Bauer, who was a pioneer in the fields of genetics, endocrinology, and chronic disease at the University of Vienna, which was one of the great universities of the world pre-World War II. This is how Bauer put this theory in 1941. This was a hormonal regulatory hypothesis of obesity. The idea was obesity had to be a hormonal disorder because you could see all the way that hormones determine fat accumulation. Hormones and enzymes, the key characteristics of the endocrine system. So he used the word lipophilic, which I'm going to have to describe. Lipophilia was a term they used to describe the preference for a tissue to accumulate excess fat. So one of the simple observations they had made is even on obese people, there are places on the body that accumulate fat and places that don't. It's like we don't tend to accumulate fat on the back of our hands or on our foreheads, but we do accumulate in very specific places. We all tend to know what those are. And so this characteristic, they called lipophilia, love of fat, and that was the characteristic to define the idea that a tissue certainly has something in the tissue determines whether or not it will accumulate fat. And Bauer said, like a malignant tumor, like the fetus, the uterus or the breast of a pregnant woman, the abnormal lipophilic tissue seizes on foodstuffs, even in the case of undernutrition. It maintains its stock and may increase it independent of the requirements of the organism. A sort of anarchy exists. The adipose tissue lives for itself and does not fit into the precisely regulated management of the whole organism. A lipomatous subject may die of starvation and still remain lipomatous. I think, you could, basset hound could die of starvation. It's still a basset hound. It still has not become a greyhound. This is how Russell Wilder put this theory in 1938. Russell Wilder was the leading authority on diabetes at the Mayo Clinic. He left in 1940 to be the first head of the Food and Nutrition Board, which was founded in the National Academies of Science to help organize food distribution during the war. He said the effect after meals of withdrawing from the circulation even a little more fat than usual might well account both for the delayed sense of satiety and for the frequently abnormal taste for carbohydrates encountered in obese persons. A slight tendency in this direction would have a profound effect in the course of time. The hypothesis deserves attentive consideration. Hugo Roney, who was a Hungarian emigre who came to the US in the 1920s and then worked at the Northwestern Medical School, he wrote the first monograph on obesity back in 1940, said the subsequent discovery that normal fat tissue is a site of considerable metabolic activity was looked upon by many as strongly supporting the theory, which is now more or less fully accepted, chiefly in Germany. And then it vanishes. Fascinating to see this in the literature. I'm going to show you this. So you've got the best medical minds in the world thinking by the late 1930s that obesity has to be a hormonal regulatory disorder. This idea that it is an energy balance disorder is just naive. And then it vanishes with the Second World War. And this documents it vanishing. So in 1941, Julius Bauer wrote a 20-page article in the Archives of Internal Medicine on obesity, in which he spent the first 10 pages explaining all the ways, like I did today, that this energy balance hypothesis is meaningless, doesn't tell you anything. And then explained the next 10 saying it's got to be a hormonal regulatory problem. But he's making fun of Newberg, in effect. He's refuting all of Newberg's work. So in 1942 and 43, Newberg publishes a series of papers basically explaining why obesity is a gluttony and sloth disorder. And in the course of one page shooting down, let me see if I don't have quotes from him. And you could see by 1959, Bauer's paper had been cited 10 times, and then never again until my book came out and resuscitated it. And Newberg's papers were cited 60, 70 times. This was at a period in time, by the way, 1941, there were maybe 5 papers published on obesity. 1950 was the first year that you got close to 100 papers. So getting 60, 70 citations was an enormous. And this basically carried the gluttony and sloth theory through the war, and the German theory just died. And part of the reason it died is because post-war there was a serious anti-German, anti-Austrian sentiment for good reason, not just in the US, but among medical doctors, many of whom had fought in the war. The leading nutritionist in the US in the post-war area was Jean Mayer of Harvard, who had fought in the French resistance during the war and hated the Germans. And his friends, who when I interviewed him, said he just refused to cite the German literature. So this theory literally died with the war. And after the war, you had all these young doctors, many of them lean, thinking, sure, it's gluttony and sloth. Isn't that obvious? And what's interesting is there are all these animal models that start being, the first animal model of obesity was created in the late 1930s. And all of them argued that this was a hormonal regulatory disorder. As Mayer said in 1968 about the particular fat strain of mice he studied, said these mice will make fat out of their food under the most unlikely circumstances, even when half-starved. These animals didn't get fat because they ate too much. They got fat if they ate at all. If they ate what lean animals ate, they got fat and the lean animals didn't. And that's what happens to those of us in America too. So you can't tell people to eat what the lean animals eat because that's what's making them fat. The question is, what do you do about it? So if obesity is a sort of excess fat accumulation, a hormonal regulatory disorder, the simple question is what regulates fat accumulation? This was worked out beginning in 1960. There were two tools that were necessary, two laboratory tools that were necessary to work this out. One was a way to measure fatty acids in the circulation, which 3 different groups discovered and developed assays in 1956. And then Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Burson in 1960 published something called the Details of a Radioimmunoassay that allowed endocrinologists for the first time ever to measure hormone levels accurately in the bloodstream. Yalow later won the Nobel Prize for it. Burson had died by then. The Nobel Committee said this caused a revolution in endocrinology, which it did, and this revolution completely passed over the field of obesity, which by the 1960s was dominated by psychiatrists trying to get fat people to eat less. From their very first papers, Yalow and Burson were learning that insulin regulates fat accumulation. The hormone insulin regulates fat accumulation. By 1965, when Burson gave the Banting lecture at the annual meeting of the American Diabetes Association, they were calling insulin the principal regulator of fat accumulation. And this diagram's from a 2010 textbook, just so you could see that this science didn't go away. The hormonal regulation of fat storage, and it's insulin, 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 and fat mobilization, insulin is inhibiting it, and all the other hormones are trying to get fat out of your fat tissue. Insulin is putting it there. And the release of fatty acids from fat cells requires only the negative stimulus of insulin deficiency. If you want to get fat out of fat cells, and if you're obese or your patients are obese, that's what you want to do. You have to lower insulin levels. That's what this science tells you. Unfortunately, Yalow and Burson weren't really caring about treating obesity. They were just learning about what was regulating fat accumulation. The same was true of most of the endocrinologists in the era. So by the mid-1960s, basically, you should have had a hypothesis of obesity that said this, because these are just the key points of fat cell regulation. When insulin is secreted or chronically elevated, fat accumulates in fat tissue. That's textbook science, as I'll show you. And when insulin levels drop, fat escapes from the fat tissues and the fat depots shrink. That's also textbook science. And we secrete insulin primarily in response to the carbohydrates in our diet, okay? So this is the first time I use that word carbohydrate, because when I have given grand rounds in med schools, I like to lure the doctors in before they start thinking I'm one of those, quote, Atkins people. As soon as I use that word, I'm one of those Atkins people. So George Cahill, who was at Harvard in the 1950s and 60s, did a lot of this research on fat tissue metabolism. He edited an American Physiological Society 600-page handbook on this science in 1965, and then he went on to become the science director of Howard Hughes for 20 years. Cahill said, look, I called him up and I said, is this all still true? And he said, yeah, carbohydrate is driving insulin, is driving fat. So that's textbook science. And if you take out these words, is driving insulin, you're left with carbohydrate is driving fat, which is the logical equivalent and is quackery. Because in the calorie theory of obesity, the only way foods can affect your weight is by how many calories they have, and a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. So if you remove driving insulin, we've got carbohydrate is driving fat. And this becomes the alternative hypothesis. I actually said to Cahill when I interviewed him, I said, Jesus, George, you edited this 600-page textbook in 1965. The purpose of this was to take this science of fat metabolism out of the world of the physiologists and the metabolism researchers and make it available for doctors and medical researchers. And I said, you've got this understanding that obesity is driven by insulin, fat accumulation is driven. Why don't you at least come at it with the hypothesis that insulin is driving fat accumulation? You lower insulin, you'll lower fat accumulation. The way to lower insulin is to reduce the carbohydrates. And he said, because we know what causes fat accumulation. And I said, what's that, George? And he said, people are lazy. I wish I were joking. Here's the alternative hypothesis. It was not embraced at the time by anyone but diet doctors. Like any growth defect, obesity is a hormonal regulatory disorder, like any growth defect. Okay, like type 2 diabetes, it's fundamentally a disorder of insulin signaling. Type 2 diabetes and obesity are so closely associated that most people, including me, think of it as two sides of the same coin. If one is an insulin signaling disorder, then the other is very likely an insulin signaling disorder. And then the quackery, it's triggered by the carbohydrate content of the diet. So not all carbs, because not all carb-containing foods have the same amount of carbs. So bread, cereal, rice, pasta, these are high glycemic index carbohydrates. The fact that they happen to be the base of the food guide pyramid that we were being told to eat 6 to 11 times a day begins to explain some of the data Andreas presented. And sweets, sugars, probably through a different mechanism by my understanding, although not everyone agrees with me. Green leafy vegetables, while the energy in it comes from carbs, there's so much fiber and water that you actually have very few digestible carbohydrates in large portions. I am not as sanguine about fruit as our health authorities. So here's your alternative hypothesis. Refined grains, starches, and sugars cause dysregulation of insulin signaling. The result is excess fat accumulation, obesity, and the obesity epidemic. That's just textbook science without being afraid of the implications, because you were taught something was quackery in medical school. So the implications are fascinating. Today, the conventional wisdom is this: all diets that result in weight loss do so on one basis and one basis only. They reduce total calorie intake. That's the textbook of obesity, the latest edition, 2012. The alternative hypothesis would be all diets that result in weight loss do so on one basis and one basis only. They reduce circulating insulin. The way to do that is by restricting carbohydrates. So the problem is, if this hypothesis is right, and you want a dietary treatment of obesity that works, you have to lower insulin. You have to lower insulin a lot. I'm going to show you that in a second. And the way to do that is by this hypothesis, carbohydrates are literally fattening. There's not a choice. Just like cigarettes literally will give you lung cancer, so if you don't want to get lung cancer, you don't smoke. If you're predisposed to get fat easily, and you don't want to, then regrettably what you end up having to do is not eat carbohydrates, if this hypothesis is right. So it's got this ridiculously long history. The problem is it was a conventional wisdom from 1820s onward. I've used this line in every book. I'm going to use it in my next one. British Journal of Nutrition article written by co-authored by one of the two leading British dietitians. 1963, every woman knows that carbohydrates are fattening. This is a piece of common knowledge which few nutritionists would dispute. And every woman did know. My mother's generation grew up believing if you didn't want to be fat, you didn't eat bread, pasta, potatoes, rice, sweets, and you didn't drink beer. And then what happened is our brilliant nutritionists decided that dietary fat might cause heart disease. They couldn't actually demonstrate it with their tests, but they came to believe it anyway, and they brainwashed us to think we have to eat low-fat diets. The abomination of a skinless chicken breast. Sorry. I promised I would be good tonight, but I'm a little sleep-deprived. This is what's fascinating. Go back to the late 1940s, early 1950s, which I did, and you look for diets for obesity in the medical journals, and I found 5 of them published by reasonably good medical schools: Harvard, Stanford, Cornell, Rush, and I forget what the 5th was. They were all identical to this one published by Raymond Green in the Practice of Endocrinology. Raymond Green was the leading British endocrinologist in the mid-20th century, happened to be the brother of Graham Greene. This was prior to the understanding of how insulin regulates fat accumulation. But this was a diet for obesity, and it was very simple. And this can be very simple. Foods to be avoided: bread, everything made with flour, cereals, potatoes, white root vegetables, foods containing much sugar, all sweet. You don't eat these foods because they are literally fattening. That was the lie. It's not about 10 grams or 20 grams or 7% or 14%. These foods are fattening, and you can eat as much as you like of the following, because they're not. They didn't understand what they had learned. What they learned in the 1960s was the science underlying this. But by the 1960s, obesity was dominated by psychiatrists and psychologists trying to get fat people to eat less. Here's the catch. Why keto? Why this very low diet carb nonsense? This phrase: adipose tissue is exquisitely sensitive to the inhibitory effect of insulin on free fatty acid release. I could go back to that slide. Insulin not just stimulates an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase to take up fat from the bloodstream and put it in fat cells, it inhibits an enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase in the fat tissue, which the job is to break down triglycerides into fatty acids so they can be out and be used for fuel. When you secrete insulin, when you think about eating carbs, like warm donuts, everybody in this room just secreted insulin. And that insulin shut down the release of fat from their fat cells because their fat cells are exquisitely sensitive to this. So this was a study done at the University of Texas Southwestern and the University of Texas San Antonio. I'm going there to talk tomorrow. We're done. Is that the 1 hour or the 45-minute warning? 50 minutes. Okay, we're almost done. This is the most important graph in the business, okay? This is insulin coming down. This was in young, healthy college students, lean, healthy college students. The insulin comes down. It's showing how much fat is both released into the bloodstream, mobilized from fat tissue, and oxidized and used for fuel. And as insulin comes down, there's no change because the fat tissue is so sensitive to the insulin that this amount of insulin, even 4 orders of magnitude, doesn't change the effect on fat mobilization. And then you get to a threshold. Okay, very low levels, manifest at low physiological plasma, at which point your insulin basically, the fat tissue finally relents and dumps and allows you to utilize the fat that you've stored. And the problem is you don't know where this threshold is. It's assuredly different for everyone, but virtually all of us live our lives up here above the threshold. And if you're eating carbs at all, and what's fascinating is to go back and read the early reports even prior to this research. So there was a fellow who was doing low-carb diet studies at DuPont, the paint company in Delaware in the 1950s. He said he had an obese patient, an executive who lost 50 pounds on a very low-carb diet. If he had 1 apple a day, his weight loss stopped. And what that's telling you is 1 apple a day was enough to push him up here. And the more time you stay below the threshold, the more you're mobilizing your own fat and using that for fuel. You're burning your own fat. And the more time you're below the threshold, you have access to that fat. So the explanation for why you're not hungry is not because, in my book, I could be wrong, not because ketones inhibit appetite, not because fat takes longer to be absorbed from your stomach, but because when your insulin levels are very low, you can actually eat the fat you've stored. Your body can use that for fuel. If you're up here, it can't do it, and it won't do it. So now you burn through carbs, your blood sugar's coming down, you eat because you're hungry, because you can mobilize and oxidize your fat. What's fascinating about this, so like I said, diet doctors started to catch on to this in the 60s. People had conversion narratives similar to Andreas, similar to mine, even though mine happened after I did my research. The most famous was Atkins. So the American Heart Association is Harvard. These people, they all knew Atkins. This was a very small club by then. They didn't like him, and they thought his high-fat diet was going to kill people. These are very well-meaning doctors. So 2 of them, a physician, a cardiologist who used to be Atkins' boss, and a nutritionist who used to work at Harvard, wrote this critique of the low-carbohydrate ketogenic weight reduction diet. They panned him, called it a denunciation of the diet, and they knew this. Fat is mobilized when insulin secretion diminishes. And yet, low-carbohydrate diets are bizarre concepts in nutrition that should not be promoted to the public as if they were established scientific principles. And rather than work to test them, because a low-carbohydrate diet is designed to diminish insulin secretion and therefore mobilize fat so you can burn it. Anyway, instead of studying it, this paper was used primarily to argue that this is quackery and we should never pay attention again until people like Eric Westman finally decided that attention had to be paid. So that's the end result. In the 1970s, I documented this in Good Calories, Bad Calories, and I agree with Andreas. There's a lot of Americans who can't read it either because it's too long, not just Swedes. 1970s, the obesity world, so the first NIH conference on obesity was 1973, and that sort of launched the study of obesity in the US, and the entire field was dominated by 6 old white men who thought they knew better and didn't even study obesity. Okay, they were cardiologists and psychologists and people who wanted to be ambitious, and they wrote the textbooks, they organized the conferences, they wrote the chapters on obesity in each of the conferences. They knew Atkins, and they didn't like him, and they thought he was killing people, and they wanted to get rid of the Atkins diet, and in order to do it, that was the bathwater. The baby was the hormonal regulation of fat accumulation. Why people fatten easily, and from the 1980s onward, it's not in the textbooks. It's barely in the journal articles. According to the conventional wisdom, people fatten easily because they eat too much. That's the solution. So all the science that I've given you was just, I've spent my last 20 years of my life studying this. It still mystifies me. Okay, put somebody on a diet. This is what Andreas said, just because, okay, great. I buy it. Maybe there's scientific reason for these diets, but won't they kill people? And this is one of my, 2013 meta-analyses. You put people on low carbohydrates diets. It's associated with significant decrease in body weight, body mass index, abdominal circumference, systolic blood pressure, diastolic. Everything gets better, except maybe LDL, which is sort of God's joke. For 50 years, in the 1960s and 1970s, our brilliant nutritionists decide that they are going to focus on LDL cholesterol as the single and most important cause of heart disease without any significant evidence, clinical trial evidence to support it. And lo and behold, the diet that can reverse obesity and diabetes, etc., might raise LDL. Okay. I don't know what to do about that. Thank you very much. I hope we still have time for questions. Thank you. Thank you. Microphone? It's got to be at least one question. Ideally two. Yes.
Hi, Gary. My name is Brian Williamson. I'm a nobody. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a Ph.D. But you have a huge responsibility to all of us because of the work that you did, the research that you did, the tireless hours. You basically wrote 2 Ph.D.s or 3 Ph.D.s in good calories, bad calories. And because of that, we all were able to trudge forward, figure out our health, and I just want to say on behalf of everyone else, yes, I'm speaking for all of you, thank you.
That's not the kind of question I meant. Thank you. I'm blushing.
Hi, Gary. I'm John Terry, and my question is, you said that there's a level of insulin in the blood at which the fat cells, if you are above that level, they're not going to release fat. My question is if someone's been on a ketogenic or a low-carb diet for a long time, does that threshold of insulin level in the blood reduce? Because I've noticed that as I've done the ketogenic diet, the amount of carbs that will kind of kick me out of ketosis has kind of gone down.
And the answer is quite possibly. I mean, one of the problems here is we know so little. What I'm giving is the sort of skeleton of why this should work, why we should expect it to work. And then, because none of this research was done, we don't know the answers to any of these questions. Anecdotally, like even myself, over the years, I needed to lower my, a diet I could tolerate, an amount of carbs I could tolerate 20 years ago, I wouldn't be able to tolerate today, except this surgery is a great weight loss tool. I think part of this is also about finding ways to stay below that threshold. And one of the interesting things, this is in response to your thinking about how to do this diet. And I think it's the reason why the idea of the ketogenic diet, if you're in ketosis, you're below the threshold. And I've had long talks with Steve Finney and Jeff Volek about, do you just have to be, is the ketosis necessary? If you're not below the threshold, you're not going to generate ketones. Because if you're below the threshold, you're going to be mobilizing fat and oxidizing it. And the good thing is if you're mobilizing your own fat, you will not be hungry because your body will burn it for fuel. And your ketones will supply your brain, but we don't even know how many people need that. One of the things I did a year ago is I spent last fall speaking with physicians who prescribe these diets and dietitians, about 100 of them. And most of them didn't care about ketosis. They just wanted to get people to stop eating fattening carbohydrates. And if they could do that, if people didn't lose weight, ketosis was a way to sort of, another way to monitor whether or not they're compliant. Can I believe them when they say they're not eating carbs? But other than that, you know, all these things are unknown. We're accumulating an enormous amount of anecdotal evidence, but that doesn't actually answer those questions. It just tells us what happened to other people. So,
thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Gary. Great talk as always. I'm David Diamond. Both you and Andreas have addressed God's joke on mankind, playing around with LDL and this great fear we all have of LDL. And for those of you who will be up in the abominable time of 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'm going to talk about how, in fact, you want to have high LDL. An increase in LDL with a low-carb diet is actually a very good thing. And in fact, it's entirely a sham, which is this fear of LDL, why people are driven to take medication that they should not take, such as the statins. So I'll cover that tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock.
Okay. And I'm going to voice just a bit of skepticism. He might be right. But we're all, it's basically, how we deal with this problem personally is you know, how we assess risk and our own risks. Without the clinical trials, we really don't know. And unfortunately, it could be 20 years before the clinical trials are done. So there's a lot of arguments you could make, like the arguments I just made, that you could support it with anecdotal evidence. But when it comes to, the way to think about this, and for this I wish I had come up with this, because I should have, but I didn't. It's a physician in Vancouver from South Africa, Martin Andre, I think. He said for 50 years we've been prescribing diets based on a hypothesis. The hypothesis is that LDL cholesterol causes heart disease and will live longer if we lower LDL cholesterol, therefore we should eat low-fat diets. And the difference is you put somebody on a low-carb diet and you see them get healthier. So, you know, their weight comes down, their diabetes status improves, blood pressure comes down, you know, they feel better, they look better, they have more energy. So the conventional wisdom is prescribe by hypothesis, keep LDL low. Even if the person lives to be 90, you don't actually know if the diet helped. That's the problem with hypothesis-driven applications. If I go on this diet and I lose 40 pounds, that's a good thing, and I know it's a good thing. If I go on the diet and I live to be 80, and then I drop dead of a heart attack, we don't know if the diet lengthened my life by 10 years or shortened it by 10 years. There's no way to know. God doesn't give us that information. So you're just speculating. So even if it's true that we're better off with high LDL, you're not going to feel better if you have high LDL. You're not going to, you know, and it's a controversial. There's a lot of people I like and respect who don't believe that, our LDL particle number to be precise. So it's a complicated thing. As a physician, you know, what I hear over and over again is the same conversion, again, the same thing that Andreas said. Put your patients on these diets, get them to stick with these diets, they will be healthier. They'll get off their drugs. Maybe the LDL is going to affect their risk of heart disease, but since so does everything else that's gotten better, it's hard to believe they're not much healthier. Triglycerides come down. That means you're going to, you know, blood pressure comes down. That's a great thing. Weight comes down. That's a great thing. Glucose tolerance improves. That's a great thing. All those things matter, but it still doesn't tell you whether or not they're going to live longer. You're assuming they're going to live longer because you've made them healthier in the short term, and it's a good assumption, but not necessarily true. It's a good assumption that if I make someone healthier in the short term, they'll be healthier in the long term. But you need clinical trials. So
that's a great introduction to my talk. Tomorrow morning.
Hi, Gary. This is Amber O'Hearn. Thank you. You mentioned that you think that there might be a different mechanism between sugar and starch, and you might not have time to explain that, but maybe you could give us a few low-carb crumbs about what you're thinking.
Yeah, just again, briefly, I mean, the fructose component of sugar is metabolized in the liver. So you can think of it as our liver evolved to see the sugar in fruit bound up in fiber. So a tiny bit of sugar in fruit bound up in fiber that you might get a month, 2 months a year, that would take time to digest, that would trickle into your circulation, and then your liver would metabolize it. It might even make you a little fatter. It might even be a signal. We evolved to make you a little fatter so you could store some energy for the coming winter if the fruit was ripening in the late summer. Then we created refined sugar, and then we created sugary beverages, and now what we get is this flood of fructose on our liver, from the moment we wake up, from our sweetened yogurts and our ripe bananas and our orange juice and everything, our snacks. And the hypothesis I put forth in the case against sugar is that basically sugar is the trigger of insulin resistance. So if you want to take a population and make it insulin resistant, doesn't matter what they ate. So it could be a Southeast Asian population living exclusively on rice and fish and fermented vegetables, or an Inuit population living on caribou and whale meat. If you want to make them insulin resistant and so prime them to become obese and diabetic, you pour fructose onto their livers while you're increasing insulin levels with the glucose, and that combination causes insulin resistance, and now all carbs will make these people fat and diabetic. That's kind of the theory. So instead of just elevating, some people believe all you have to do is, I hope I'm doing David Ludwig justice, but David Ludwig believes that sugar is bad because it's basically a high glycemic index carb that raises blood sugar levels, and that it's insulinemia from high blood sugar that causes insulin resistance. I think the sugar is a necessary ingredient because of the way we metabolize fructose in high doses. So.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary, for a great talk. And as I recall, you, like me, got into this area some time ago, not because we really wanted to be in it, and followed what we thought was kind of bad science, and now it's 20 years later. Where do we go from here? From your perspective, is it policy, is it research, is it just people doing it in their own thing, or, spread some wisdom?
That's a very good question. The world is both changing very quickly and not changing at all, and it's hard to understand. So like I said, when Eric started this, how many physicians do you think in the US were prescribing low-carb diets? 5. Yeah, I'm going to throw in another 5 thinking we didn't know them and they were doing it in secret, but they'd prescribe it, and then if their patient saw any other doctor, the doctor would be horrified and talk them off the diet. Who cares if you lost 60 pounds? Your LDL is, you can have a heart attack. My favorite line on that was from a woman whose name I forget, who I better remember before I put my book, who said she's lost 140 pounds on the ketogenic diet. She went from 380, she was down to 240. This was about a year ago. And having lost 140 pounds, people were complaining about how much bacon she ate and how it would kill her. And she said, when I was 380, nobody complained about my diet. Now that I've lost 140 pounds, they're saying I'm eating too much bacon. Anyway, so now there are clearly thousands of physicians in the world. Like I said, it's likely that there's 10,000 or a few tens of thousands who are prescribing these diets, and their patients are getting healthier. And then there's companies like Virta and your group who are making people clearly healthy. The type 2 diabetes epidemic is a horrible thing, but it's changed the context of going on these diets. It used to be you're 30 or 40 pounds overweight, you go on a low-carb diet, you lose 20 pounds, you're not that strict, and then your job still sucks, and you're fighting with your spouse, and you can't self-medicate with donuts and beer anymore, and then you fall off the diet and you say it doesn't work. But if it's a choice between being on insulin or not being on insulin, managing a chronic disease or not managing a chronic disease, that's a huge difference. And clearly, these well-formulated ketogenic diets, when you adhere to them, or low-carb diets, will allow type 2 diabetics to get off most to all of their drugs, including their blood pressure medication. And then the sustainability isn't an issue anymore. You know, I've had a corn allergy since I was a kid. I can sustain not eating corn because if I eat corn, I get sick. If the difference between eating carbs and not eating carbs is being diabetic or not, people will sustain that. So I think that's changing the world. And companies like Virta will change the world. I founded Nusi because I thought we needed to get research done that would get people off this idiot energy balance idea. There will be another Nusi-funded study published in the next month or two that is going to help shed light on this, and I don't think it'll have any effect, because I think people are just so set in what they believe that it's become an evidence-free zone. I'm not, even though I talk about the need for research, we need research so we can understand and physicians can understand how best to use these diets, how best to get people to eat, how best to keep them doing it, what the various, what the LDL really means, stuff like that. I'm not sure we could change perspectives, but I think as more and more people embrace this, what people like me and Nina Teicholz and Eric have done is not only have we shed light on the science, but we've convinced people that you can eat like this and it won't kill you. And the whole keto diet phenomenon, which is huge, it's also a little scary huge, because a lot of it is clearly a fad. A lot of young people just want to improve their athletic performance, who won't stick with it. But everyone who does it, loses 50, 60 pounds, has friends and relatives who want to know how that happened. Everyone who goes on this to reverse their diabetes and loses 40 pounds, and then they have other doctors who 10 years ago would have said, I don't care how much weight you lost, quit the diet. Now they'll say, keep doing what you're doing. And when they have another patient come in, they'll say, I don't really like to recommend this, but Gloria lost 60 pounds doing keto, and don't tell anyone I told you. But so it's, it spreads sort of from patient to patient, person, Facebook group to Facebook group. And all that is happening, and where it'll go and how far it'll go, I don't know. The flip side is you've also got a very powerful vegetarian and vegan movement in this country that sees this as kind of the enemy, weirdly, because the easiest way to do these diets is with a lot of animal products. And that's also a growing movement. And I don't, and it's fueled by some very legitimate, moral, ethical, and environmental beliefs. And they're very passionate, and we tend to butt heads a lot. But, we'll see how it goes. So I don't know. I mean, there's a lot more people involved. We have a lot of allies now. In the past 6 months, a former FDA chief, former head of the FDA, has sort of come out of the closet as being on our side. Former managing editor of JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, has, these are, older men. They're no longer in power. They don't have anything to lose. But they're saying, this makes a lot of sense, and if nothing else, we have to study it, and we have to get it right. And when you have these just completely unacceptable levels of obesity and diabetes, there's more and more motivation to get it right. Now, if we just had an administration I was willing to work with. Anyway, so thank you, Eric, and thank you all. This is in the University of Eenfeldt.
You have time for one more question and a quick answer.
Well, actually, I just wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, obviously, it shows just how much of an influence you are that this line has been almost entirely speakers at this conference asking you questions. I also wanted to commend you on your answer with LDL. I myself, as you know, dabble a little bit in lipids. But wouldn't it be great, given your answer, which I agree with, that it's very complex to try to test a rather myopic hypothesis against something as complex as the metabolism? Wouldn't it be great if there actually are a kind of hyper-responder that has low cardiovascular risk markers across the board, but with the exception of extremely high LDL, to actually take on the lipid hypothesis quite directly?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question.
Well, all I'm saying is that the part of the research that I'm doing up to this point that I find to be the most fascinating is there seems to be a phenotype, in particular a kind of hyper-responder, and they tend to be very lean, they tend to be very fit, they tend to have high HDL cholesterol, low triglycerides, very low risk markers across the board on inflammation, on blood pressure, on weight, in just about every regard that you'd want them to look cardiovascularly fit, but yet they ride in the 90th percentiles for their LDL-C and their LDL-P. And I believe that in a very short time, I don't think it will take like 30 years or 40 years, we should be expecting them to have progressive atherosclerosis at a very high rate. And I believe if we're not seeing this, that will say quite a lot.
I mean, so what you're basically saying is there a way we could design a clinical trial that, and you could do it. I mean, it's interesting. If you were using a plaque progression in the artery, something that's directly measurable, could you imagine a clinical trial in which these people, if they have, I mean, I'm assuming that if I were to get, well, yeah, I mean, you could probably design a trial. It would be difficult, only because it's going to have to be a randomized controlled trial, so they can't start, I don't know, it'd be interesting to talk about. Yeah, I mean, clearly it can be tested. You can test longevity. That's not going to happen. We don't know if you can test, if you could do the trial long enough to see if they have other chronic diseases that are somehow caused by the high. But the idea is it's supposed to give us a heart attack. You're stuck with risk factors one way or the other. And people always question risk factors, especially, and they'll really question them as soon as the study gets the answer they don't want. Then they'll come up with the reason why it's the wrong risk factor. But yeah, I think it can be done. But that's what you would need. We would need something like that to do it. And it would be interesting to discuss it. I mean, in my ideal world, the research community, the medical establishment takes this seriously enough, and you bring in other good scientists from outside the medical establishment, because I think the medical establishment is kind of uniquely lacking in good scientists, I hate to say. And then you have them discuss how best to test this question. And what tests can we do, and then the government funds this test. And that would be a wonderful thing to see. It's kind of what we had hoped for from NUSI, and we just didn't make that happen. But that's the kind of thing that would need to be done. And yeah, then that question could probably be answered.
Well, thank you for the fantastic presentation, once again.
Thank you, David. That was fun.
Let's give our speakers tonight another round of applause. Hey, a couple of housekeeping notes for physicians that want CME credits for this weekend. Tomorrow we will have the sheets printed out. We'll have them out at the front tables, and we'll make sure that we distribute so that you can get the credit. Second thing, for Twitter users, use the hashtag LowCarbHouston. Y'all have a good evening. We'll see you at 8 a.m. Thank you.